Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents A Cosmic Encounter, a true story of an alien abduction, by Stewart W. Bench, narrated by Stephen Bell Davies. Publisher's note: in this audio edition, you will hear references to visual elements present in the print and e-book formats of the book. Introduction. This is the story of my life-altering encounter with extraterrestrial beings. The intent is to provide the reader with a highly absorbing and entertaining narrative that offers an unprecedented wealth of information on the aliens and their technology. The extraordinary episode began in the early 1990s, just before the TV series The X-Files popularized the concept of alien visitation. Contemporary literature, which I had for years enthusiastically devoured, presented accounts of human contact with aliens that quite typically offered only vague details or bizarre and often preposterous assertions. This paradigm provided a fulcrum from which to assess the extraordinary insight granted me into the cosmic visitors' physiology and their remarkable technology. What I discovered regarding the aliens and their ship was documented at the time in the rigorous regimen instilled in graduate engineers. Likewise, the information was filtered and colored by the prism of that training as well. What resulted was a record of observation and explanation, and on occasion, conjecture and theory, propounded from an engineer's perspective. Many years following the encounter, the realization dawned on me that I was in possession of a plethora of information that is unparalleled in typical books and the media. This led to the decision to advance public awareness by publishing this account, which the reader will hopefully find to be both fascinating and informative. This book is organized into two parts. The first describes my 3 meetings with the extraterrestrials and cites what were at first numerous rewarding consequences. The ominous and devastating turn that events later took for me and my family is revealed in a number of chilling anecdotes. Part 2 offers extraordinary insight into the aliens and their technology. The aliens' mission and their physical and mental makeup are discussed in detail. The structure and operation of their spaceship is also extensively explored in areas such as propulsion, navigation, and life support systems, fail-safe and protection methods, crew quarters, and more. Included at the end of the second section is a discussion prompted by research into what I perceive to be a few popular myths connected with extraterrestrials. To avoid the possibility of annoying repetition, the terms alien, gray, and extraterrestrial are used interchangeably throughout this narrative. Part 1. Encounter. Chapter 1. Small-town boy. When other kids were fascinated with pterodactyls and tyrannosaurs, I was captivated by the admittedly primitive movies and comics of the late 1950s and early 60s that depicted rocket ships, Venusians, and Martians. During summer vacation from elementary school, my friends and I would drag home large cardboard boxes tossed out as trash by the local appliance store. These made great rocket ships for youngsters with keen imaginations. We'd search the garage and cellar for stuff that we could visualize as belonging in a spaceship. Adding to our imagined realism were an old radio chassis, a large electric motor, a defunct window fan, and a cardboard control panel with a few real electrical switches attached and dials and knobs drawn on it in crayon. We'd seat ourselves on folding chairs in front of a window cut in the box and take off for distant worlds on an afternoon's adventure. In a few days the weather would do in our creation, and one of the dads would fold up the soggy mess and toss it in the trash. There was always another rocket ship waiting at the square deal supply. As a teenager, I developed a strong interest in the country's achievements in space exploration, and in particular the Apollo program's manned missions to the moon. As a young adult, I would scour science periodicals for articles on the NASA probes and relished the fantastic photos of the planets and moons transmitted from afar. I was certain that the popular imagery of green, gray, humanoid, and reptilian aliens portrayed in the stuff I was reading was fantasy. My conception of a real extraterrestrial life form had been that of an amoeba, squirming its way through the ooze at the bottom of a lake on an otherwise barren place a few hundred light years from here. That changed abruptly in 1977 with the release of Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind. For the first time, it dawned on me that extraterrestrial life could actually be a race of intelligent, bipedal beings. My horizon expanded markedly with the launch of the Hubble Space Telescope in 1990. Clearly visible in the stunning photographs returned to Earth were colorful interstellar gas clouds and billions of stars, many presumably with planets, some that might even harbor life. I began to devour whatever I could find on the subject of aliens, human abductions, animal dismemberment, crop circles, UFO sightings and crashes, lights in the sky, the small airborne spheres called orbs, you name it. Although thoroughly fascinated, it was obvious that a lot of it was out-and-out fiction. Still, I continued my reading, relishing those tomes I considered authentic, knowing that this material was the closest acquaintance I'd ever have with this subject that so enthralled me. The rest of my history, up to a point, was fairly mundane. I was born in 1952 in upstate New York, and attended a centralized school in my hometown. Following high school graduation in 1970, I went on to receive an electrical engineering degree from a state university. A month or so after graduation, I interviewed for a position as a staff engineer in a newly minted small electronics firm located an hour's drive, in good weather, from home, and began a 42-year career there. I knew my future wife in high school. Bev and I dated off and on for a number of years, interrupted by the 4 years we both attended college. We were married in 1975 and moved into a tiny rented apartment for a few years. We were both employed and eventually secured a loan to buy a home on a small lot in our hometown. Our son, Ted, was born in 1976, and his sister, Anne, was born in 1978. Ours was a comfortable and rewarding existence. We experienced the typical family triumphs and disappointments, joys and sorrows, laughter and tears for the first 17 years of our marriage. And then things changed. Chapter 2. Red Squirrels. In the late spring and early summer of 1992, we experienced a population explosion of red squirrels. Adults and at least one litter of baby squirrels had taken up residence in our snowmobile shed and a smaller nearby tool shed. Aside from their voracious appetite, they ate more than their share of the generous supply of black oil sunflower seed in our bird feeders. They are notorious for chewing stuff that shouldn't be chewed, electrical wiring, for example. The little buggers managed to gnaw an entry hole in an aluminum vent on the tool shed. It became imperative, a wifely decree, to do something to reduce the squirrel population. Doing them in wasn't an option. I'm too much of a pacifist. So, a live capture trap was purchased, and a trapping campaign was undertaken. Attracted to a gob of peanut butter that we smeared on the trap's trigger platform, we began to have success capturing the critters. Relocation of the captured squirrels was a sticky issue. In some regions, such a thing is frowned upon by the authorities. Not being certain about local restrictions in this still predominantly farming area of the state, and not wishing to get an official ruling that might result in a much less palatable solution, we elected to go ahead with the repatriation endeavor. Pivotal in the effort was finding a location where the newcomers wouldn't be likely to interact with human habitation. In this, we are particularly fortunate in our area because there are large expanses of out-of-the-way roadways, adjoining pasture land, and wooded areas with widely separated homesteads and farms. We found an ideal spot within a few miles of home. I had already made a number of relocation trips to this unpopulated spot, believing that keeping the squirrel families together was the humane thing to do. One particular late afternoon trip on an unusually hot day in late August was to be fateful. Having dropped off the 5th or 6th squirrel, I turned the truck around and headed homeward. A half-mile or so from the drop-off point, I glanced at the mirror and observed what appeared to be a single headlight on a vehicle a fair distance behind me. Believing it was probably a motorcycle, as unlikely as that would be on this particular roadway, I initially gave it little thought. I was doing around 50 miles per hour, and it was obvious that the motorcycle was gaining on me. It occurred to me that the rider was going much too fast for the uneven, rocky, and dusty surface of what we call in these parts a dirt road. Before long it became apparent that the light, now very bright and almost filling the rearview mirror, was not a part of something on the roadway. It was attached to something above the road. I began to slow the truck as the view in the mirror took the form of a metallic saucer-shaped vehicle hovering a few yards above the surface. At this point, things began to happen in quick succession. First, the FM radio station I was listening to became garbled, then noisy, and then the radio became quiet. Shortly thereafter, the truck's engine began to misfire. I pulled off to the side of the road, turning off the engine. It probably would have died on its own at that point, and found that the truck was engulfed in shade on what was a bright, sunny day, and in an area without a tree in sight. It was stone quiet, except for occasional metallic creaking of the truck body. The truck was vibrating slightly at a low and inaudible frequency. Frankly, scared poopless, or more precisely, closer to the other extreme, I considered the few options available to me. Stay in the truck, which was obviously under some sort of extraordinary external influence, or bail out, hoping to make a getaway. The first and most reasonable thing to do was to see if the engine would start. It turned over and fired intermittently, but wouldn't continue to run. With the engine malfunctioning and the air conditioner inoperative, the prospect of hanging around in the truck on such an unusually hot day was unappealing. I decided to leave the truck. At this point, a bit of curiosity overcame me as well. Just what was this thing that had somehow disabled the engine and was hovering over my truck, causing this huge area of shade? I opened the door and stepped out. In retrospect, this was an unwise move. I immediately became aware of a tingling sensation on my unprotected skin, and the feeling of being exposed to intense sunshine, even though the sun was shaded by the object. My discomfort was soon forgotten at the amazing sight I was witnessing. Wow! I had read many descriptions of alien spacecraft and had seen many blurry, nondescript photos of them. It constantly perplexed me that with the proliferation of video and still cameras, no decent pictures of one had ever been published. Well, I sure didn't need a picture. There was one now floating 75 feet or so over my head. It was a gray metallic color and was shaped very much like two deep dessert plates, one inverted on top of the other, stuck together at the rims. Indeed, the familiar description of a flying saucer. There was a bulbous protrusion with what appeared to be observation ports mounted topside. This feature wasn't visible from my position at the time, in that it was eclipsed by the mass of the ship due to the sight angle. I observed the dome later as the craft departed. I estimate the dimensions of the craft to have been 30 feet or so in diameter, and 15 feet at its maximum height, excluding the top part that added another 3 feet or more in height. Having breathtakingly discovered the source of the shade engulfing the truck, and the electric or magnetic field that was causing the truck to vibrate, I decided the best course of action was to put as much distance as possible between myself and that spaceship. Not so easily done, as it turned out. As I briskly walked away from the saucer and my truck, which it obviously still had in its clutches, my heart sank as I turned to look back at the craft. It had begun to move and was following me as I trotted along the road. The saucer soon overtook me and sped ahead, descending to a few feet above the roadway, blocking my retreat in that direction. Two can play this game. I abruptly turned and hurriedly marched off in the opposite direction. Again, the ship quickly overtook me again and hovered a few feet from the road surface a few yards ahead of me. Okay, they've got me. Now what? As I stood there, honestly quaking in my boots, 3 struts emerged from the bottom of the craft and appeared to lock in place. The ship then quietly descended until supported on the struts. After a minute or so, a panel, roughly 4 feet in height, opened in the side of the craft, leaving a rectangular aperture that revealed a dimly illuminated interior. A ramp then deployed from the bottom of the port and continued its extension until it contacted the surface of the road. As I watched in near panic, a dark form briefly obscured the light visible in the opening. A person, or more appropriately an entity, then emerged from the craft. The being's appearance conformed in many respects to familiar descriptions I'd read of aliens popularly known as Greys. The first entity was soon joined by a second, who could have been his twin in that they looked exactly alike to me. Both were about 4 feet tall. They had to duck when coming out of the craft, and were roughly humanoid in appearance. They were profoundly skinny, and had proportionally oversized heads. They wore what appeared to be gray and somewhat glossy suits or uniforms, covering all but their head. And surprising to me, they didn't wear a helmet or have a respirator or any other obvious form of life support system. Their facial features, except for their large dark eyes, were diminutive. A tiny slit that could roughly pass for a mouth, 2 small orifices where a non-existent nose would be, and 2 indentations where one would expect to find ears. The aliens' very thin arms were comparatively much longer than ours, and their hands had 3 long, thin fingers and a thumb. Their feet were covered in extensions of their suit or possibly boots, I couldn't be sure, and appeared to be appropriately shaped and sized for their body proportions. One of the 2 Greys was staring intently at me. Suddenly a calm feeling overtook me. The anxiety and fear that had troubled me simply melted away. I equate the feeling to the effect of taking a strong tranquilizer, except in this instance the result was immediate. The second alien then turned and re-entered the ship. A few moments later he re-emerged, carrying a few items. The second alien approached me, and before I could react, grabbed a lock of my hair, sliced it off with a sharp-edged knife-like instrument, and dropped it into a small container that he then handed to the other Grey. What the hell? I thought. Even in my alien-induced serenity, I was totally bummed out. These guys had snipped off a lock of my hair without so much as a warning. But that was nothing compared to what happened next. The first gray then grabbed my right hand and turned it palm upward. I considered resisting, but then thought better of it. The second gray then extended my middle finger and poked it with a sharp cylindrical instrument, taking a chunk of skin and flesh about 1/16 of an inch in diameter. Damn, that hurt. What's with these guys? The gray then dropped the instrument into another container and produced a vial of a viscous liquid that he dabbed on the hole in my finger. The pain immediately subsided and the bleeding stopped. Then what could very roughly be considered a conversation began between the aliens and me. The Greys didn't speak. As I came to find out, they only communicate telepathically among themselves, and also with humans, where they convey ideas, concepts, suggestions, and ethereal images that manifest in the mind of the receiving party. The process does not require either participant to possess a spoken language. At least in the case of alien or human exchange, the process is remarkably imprecise. The aliens rely on constant feedback to ensure that what they've communicated is really being understood. It can take many iterations of back-and-forth mental dialogue to nail down the essence of an exchange. Apparently, the Greys are able to mask their own communication from human interception. They had to be talking to each other the whole time, but I was left out of the conversation. Much of what I was able to discern from the aliens' attempts at reaching me was vague at best, and getting to that level of understanding was an effort. Considering that telepathic communication was totally new to me, I surmised that they were probably having as much trouble understanding me. And what I most urgently wanted to convey and have them fully understand was, leave me the hell alone. At first I was uncertain as to which entity I was communicating with. It eventually dawned on me it was the one staring at me. Although thought transfer can occur without the need for eye-to-eye contact, I learned later that the technique greatly improves the clarity of the received thought impressions. I was telepathically given the notion that I was important to these guys, that they were on a mission of exploration, that I was a potential subject, and a determination would be made later as to whether I was a suitable candidate. Depending on their subsequent evaluation, I might or might not ever see them again. I preferred the latter possibility. There was a lot I wanted to know. Why me? And if I was selected for whatever they had in mind, how would I know? And if I was chosen, just what would that entail? Would I be probed, prodded, skewered, and sliced? Considering events of the past few minutes, the prospect was not promising. The Greys were totally unresponsive to my inquiries. Maybe they didn't feel the need to satisfy my curiosity. Then again, as a rank novice in the art of telepathy, maybe they just didn't understand. The entire incident to that point must have taken less than an hour. I suddenly got the impression that I was now free to leave, and I couldn't take them up on it fast enough. I felt the very strong compulsion to return to the truck, and specifically to close any open windows. The two aliens abruptly turned, entered the waiting saucer, the ramp soon retracted, and the access port suddenly sealed without the slightest indication of a seam. I sat in the truck, waiting to see what might occur next. I knew it was unlikely that I'd be able to start the truck until the UFO left. After a few minutes, the craft slowly and silently lifted off the road, and the struts retracted into the body of the saucer, leaving no indication whatsoever of any panels or openings from which they deployed. The bright light that I had seen initially, and which it occurred to me had been extinguished during the visit, came on in dazzling intensity, and the craft shot straight up, tilted slightly, and was gone in an instant. I was profoundly glad that I had adhered to the very strong compulsion to enter the truck and close the windows during the departure. I was already feeling sunburned on my face and arms from exposure to the saucer. The truck's key was dangling in the ignition switch, which was off, but as the craft arose, the interior lights of the vehicle came on spontaneously, glowing softly. Static and a low rumble sound emitted from the radio speaker. Even inside the vehicle, the hair on my arms tingled, and my meticulously combed and slicked-down hair stood on end. I wondered as the craft disappeared if my truck was toast. Being a techno-geek, I owned an early, bulky analog cell phone commonly called a bag phone. It was home, connected to its charger. Calling a garage to arrange for a tow was out of the question. The walk to the nearest house would be tough in the summer heat, and it could be a long wait for another vehicle to happen along. The radio came on when I turned the key. The truck started normally, and greatly relieved, I headed home, shaken by what had transpired and very glad it was over. It occurred to me how ironic it was to feel the terror and excitement I had experienced contrasted with my detached, unsympathetic reaction when reading about a similar encounter involving someone else. When I arrived home, in leaving the truck, I noticed that the paint color on the hood and top of the cab was now a darker red than the sides. So be it. My compelling need at this point was for a couple of beers and a few moments of solitude in my lounge chair. Of course, the family inquired how come it took me so long to deliver that squirrel, and what I'd been doing to get that sunburn. I made up some lame excuse, something like I'd stopped to assist an older gentleman change a tire, and was rewarded with a beer or two at a bar afterward. I wasn't about to disclose the events of the day to anyone. Not yet, anyway. I reserved the right to ponder on my own timetable what had happened to me, in an attempt to reconcile it with my normally mundane lifestyle. The squirrels got a reprieve. I decided that 5 or 6 transplants were enough. The ones remaining were welcome to the birdseed. I was not about to travel to that isolated area again. I just have to come up with a reasonable excuse for abandoning the eradication program. A few weeks later, with my finger long since healed, and my unusually severe sunburn finally transformed into a deep tan, I had become convinced that my encounter was a one-time thing. I no longer cared about or even noticed the discolored paint on the truck, and the memory of the incident began to fade. I was happy to dismiss the whole affair. In time, I thought, I might eventually feel like talking about this bizarre situation with a few empathetic friends and family members. Then again, they'd probably think I had been high on something, or worse, that I was crazy. It was all behind me now, and I was none the worse for the episode. Chapter 3. Close Encounter of Another Kind. Fall and winter passed without event, or at least without an alien-inspired incident. We endured the usual allotment of snow and daydreamed, as we did every year, about a time when we might be able to escape the frigid north and spend a couple of months somewhere warm, maybe next year. I used what free time wasn't spent with a snow shovel or roof rake to read my latest acquisition of an extraterrestrial tome. By late March, we had survived yet another winter, and the last of the snowbanks left by the plow finally melted away toward the end of April. Time passed. By late spring of 1993, the grass was growing like mad, but the lawn wasn't getting the attention it deserved. We were having a particularly rough patch at work. We had taken on a fixed-price contract to design and deliver a large power supply unit, and the very aggressive delivery date was looming. We had produced a prototype that had major problems, and the engineering staff, myself included, were burning the midnight oil trying to get the thing to work right. The effort meant lots of unpaid overtime and the sacrifice of every weekend for over a month. Routine homeowner tasks suffer.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?